Hi, I'm Kim Wehle, and this is Simple Politics. My guest today, today's episode is Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State for the great state of Michigan. Secretary Benson, thank you so much for being on Simple Politics.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So we have some similarities in our backgrounds, both lawyers, but you were the youngest dean, Wayne State Law School. I'm a graduate of another law school in that state. And as I was mentioning off air, I was absolutely blown away and impressed by your many marathons, including 8 months pregnant as a mom of four. I have to say that is an actually stunning defeat in the era of Olympians this week.
Yeah, it was an issue of qualifying for the Boston Marathon and then finding out later I was pregnant and just saying, well, we'll see, take one step at a time. And it wasn't until I crossed the finish line that I realized I'd actually done it. I didn't even tell anyone, other than my husband, who rode a bike alongside as I ran. But it was fun.
I feel like I was lumbering along at that stage, so like to go a whole block. So for those who haven't been in that state in their lives, it's really truly extraordinary. Well, so much to cover, but I want to start by asking you to explain to our viewers. We have a lot of law students, and the goal of this show is to break things down into ABCs. And I know you worked with Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in civic education, and that's really the goal. And you wrote a book on secretaries of state. So can you explain, what does a secretary of state do, and why are secretaries of state associated with the question of voting?
Well, secretaries of state are the chief election officers in most states. So we oversee, in particular, the interpretation of election law and campaign finance law as it applies to actual elections, and looking at how to administer elections in a way that achieves the functions, the goals of the Constitution, of election law, and ultimately ensures that everyone can vote, that everyone can get a ballot, that they can return it, that they know all the rules. You're not only the chief election officer, but you're really the chief voter educator in the state as well. So taking that role myself as a background as an educator, as a legal educator, very seriously, and really seeing how, especially in an era like this one, where disinformation is rampant, the importance of having a voice, a leader in each state who's going to try to cut through the rhetoric and just tell voters the truth and what they need to know to exercise their right to vote.
So what is the difference between a secretary of state then and a legislature when it comes to voting? Because we're seeing, for example, in the state of Georgia, the man, a Republican in your role, Brad Raffensperger, was managing the last election. Former President Donald Trump is now under criminal investigation for calling him and being on tape saying, "Can you find me enough votes?" And my understanding is Georgia has changed its laws now to shift some of the power from the Secretary of State to the legislature. What does that balance of power mean, Secretary Benson?
Well, the Secretary of State is in an executive role. I mean, in Michigan, I'm second in line to the governor, meaning that when the governor and the lieutenant governor are outside of the state, I am acting governor. So it's an executive role, and that's separate branch from the legislature, which is much more of a political office. Oftentimes, legislators elected out of gerrymandered districts, but they write the laws and they determine the budget, whereas at the executive branch, we administer the law and we set executive visions for what our respective departments, in my case, the Department of State, should do. And then, we have specific roles, like I'm also the chief motor vehicle officer, so I get everyone their driver's licenses and, oversee that as well for the state. But we don't get to write laws as much as we get to enforce or interpret or administer or implement them. Whereas legislators are, the ones who are determining budgets and oftentimes drafting the laws. So that said, you have, and of course you have the judiciary as well. Each state does it a little differently in terms of how power is allocated, but we're certainly seeing a trend away from enabling experts to run elections, which is ultimately what many Secretary of States are or become, to legislators having more influence over elections than in years past. And election administration is really a profession. It's one that takes expertise. You can't just simply walk into the job. Oftentimes, you need that depth of experience to ensure that the election is run well. And so giving the legislators the authority, perhaps even to intervene or overturn an election that they're not happy with the results, injects politics into what really should be a nonpartisan effort of ensuring everyone can vote. And that's what we're seeing in Georgia. I often say we're seeing an effort across the country to make it harder to vote and easier to overturn an election. And that second part is what you see where in states like Texas or Arizona, where they've also stripped powers from election administrators and given it to partisan officials. You're seeing people be in a position where if they don't like the results of the voters' election, they can impose their own will, which of course is the exact opposite of what a democracy is supposed to be. And one of the reasons why our democracy is under such an assault at this moment.
Well, seems like there's two buckets here. We have casting votes and lots of discussion about new laws, and I know there's been some in Michigan I want to talk about, to make it harder to actually cast votes. Then we have counting votes. And it's the counting votes that I'm hearing you're saying is potentially the new frontier of the threat to our democracy.
Truly, and I look at really the threats as running along three parallel tracks. The first is just lies and misinformation, efforts by those in power to deceive voters and the public about their rights, about the sanctity of the elections, about the security of the process, to further their own political agenda. And that we see continuing to proliferate. Even now, here we are 8 months out of the 2020 election cycle. And something that then feeds into the second track, which is laws rewriting the rules of the game that determine how people can vote, how people can get their ballots, how people can return their ballots, and ultimately how easily people can hold those elected officials accountable through ease of participation in a process that enables their voice to be heard. And then the third track is, all of these tracks are terrible and pernicious, but the third is the worst because it would enable even when you have additional barriers to voting or misinformation proliferating, you still have the result of the voters' will emerging out of the election cycle. And if you enable actors, partisan actors, to intervene with the counting process, as many of these laws would allow, empowering challengers to come in and intervene in the way in which votes are validated and counted, or other ways overturn the very clear will of the people, you set up a potential for all of the efforts we saw in 2020 that were unsuccessful to overturn the voters' will, to potentially being successful in future elections, where essentially those who want to overturn the voters' will in future scenarios may have more power and authority to do so.
What's happening in Michigan then? Because in 2018, there was actual amendments to the Michigan Constitution to enshrine voting rights. And I wrote a piece for The Atlantic, ran on Sunday, arguing, as others have, that the federal Constitution needs an amendment to protect voting rights. But notwithstanding that amendment, and I wonder if you could explain what happened in 2018, we're seeing efforts by Republicans, frankly, in the Michigan legislature to attack the access to the ballot, make it harder to count votes. How is that possible if we have the Constitution itself that was changed by the voters?
Well, that is a question that may be determined by the state courts as and if and when laws get passed that would undermine the rights created by those voting efforts in 2018. And just take a step back, in Michigan, voters have the power to amend their state constitution or their state laws through the petition process. They can collect signatures, and then a ballot question goes on the ballot, and then voters can vote as to whether or not that proposal should amend the state constitution. And that's exactly what happened in 2018. You had voters to say, we want the right to vote from home. We want the right to vote or to register to vote up to and on election day itself. We want the right to be automatically registered to vote when we get our driver's license or state ID. So all of those became part of our state constitution, and my job upon being elected in that same cycle was to implement those new policies, which we did to great success in 2020. And yet, instead of continuing to build on that success, what happened, because that effort was so successful and led to so many more people voting than ever before, and so many more people voting from home in a way that's convenient to them than ever before, we are now seeing the legislature propose 39 bills that systematically would undo the very policies at the heart of that voter-driven and initiated initiative to amend our state constitution. So it's likely that none of these bills will get through the legislature because the governor's already said she'll veto them. And again, there are a collection of bills. You can see a review of them on our website, michigan.gov/vote, that essentially cumulatively will make it harder for citizens to vote and easier for partisan actors to intervene with the counting process and ultimately overturn an election if they don't like the results. So it's very likely through a loophole in our state constitution that enables citizens to sign a petition. You need 340,000 signatures, which amounts to 4% of our voting age population. If you have that many signatures on even that few signatures on a petition, the petition can be presented to the legislature, and the legislature can choose to adopt that petition as law, despite a governor's veto. And so it's quite likely, it's been an open discussion, that these 39 bills would be endorsed by the signatures of 340,000 registered voters. And then those signatures would be adopted by the state legislature, and these policies that collectively do undermine those state constitutional rights, the right to vote from home, the right to register and vote on election day. It's very possible that if they become law, they'll be challenged in courts, as many laws in other states have already been challenged. And we'll see what the outcome there is, both at the state and federal level. But the bottom line is, I think voters everywhere need to be prepared for it to be harder to vote in many states in 22. And there will be ongoing efforts, I believe, to push back and perhaps even overturn some of the pernicious things we're seeing here in Michigan and across the country in the months and years ahead. And all of it just underscores that we are in a very live battle over the future of our democracy that's emerging in lots of different ways. And by staying vigilant and educated and engaged on pushing back, we can be successful ultimately in the short and long term in protecting our democracy. But what history teaches us is the only thing that's ever ensured our democracy to be successful is people being engaged and demanding that it works. And if we do that, we can be successful. But if we don't, it may indeed wither on a vine. And those who don't believe in democracy may be successful at ultimately undermining it. But I know on your watch and my watch, that's not going to happen. But it does require all of us working together to make sure that we succeed.
Yeah, it's we the people, not we the politicians or we the powerful.
Right.
I agree. Could you take us inside an election process a little bit? Because when I hear people talk about fraud,
Mm.
and the stop the steal, which of course was former President Trump's rallying cry, we're still hearing it. Unfortunately, members of the Republican Party at the federal level also still adhering to that, notwithstanding now we have a commission looking to the January 6th insurrection. What I say to myself is, wait a minute, the fraudsters, the alleged fraudsters are regular people. Am I wrong? They're your next door neighbor, the person at the grocery store, the librarian, the teacher, who come out to miraculously, even in a pandemic, heroically make our elections work. Could you just take us in just a slice of what it really looks like to administer these elections and who's actually doing it?
Yeah, well, in Michigan, it's a little different in every state, but in Michigan, it's very decentralized. We actually have 1,600 clerks in our 83 counties that at the local level administer elections. And what that means is really three things. One, getting everyone a ballot who's registered. Well, I would say four things. Maybe we'll start with registering every eligible citizen to vote. And then number two, getting everyone a ballot who wants to vote in that particular election, making sure they can get a ballot either in person on election day or through the mail if they'd like to vote from home or absentee. And then making sure people can return that ballot, whether it's through the mail or in a drop box or in person or by voting in person on election day. And then finally, the fourth is counting, validating every vote and then counting it and giving the results to the public. That's it in a nutshell. And so when we broke down preparing for 2020, it was really along those four lines. How do we make sure everyone who wants to be registered to vote is? How do we make sure everyone who wants a ballot gets one in a way that's convenient for them? How do we make sure they can then return that ballot on time? And then fourth, how do we make sure we count those ballots efficiently and securely? That's really the infrastructure of elections. And the way that all of those things happen is by clerks at the local level and then election workers helping and supporting those clerks make all of the wheels go round. And then the important thing is, running elections is not just about the machinery, the technicalities of elections, the infrastructure. It's also about educating voters about how to get their ballot, how to return their ballot, how to have faith that their vote has been counted through ballot tracking systems or through machines that if you vote in person, give you a thumbs up and say your vote has been counted. So all of that, there's a voter education component to every single piece of election administration. Then there's a final component that really emerged in 2020, which is battling misinformation. That it is now just as important that we run a good election, that we educate voters about that election and how to participate, and then also we prepare at every level to counter falsehoods and misinformation and efforts to deceive voters about those first two pieces. Doing all three together, building the infrastructure, educating voters about it, and then countering misinformation is how we collectively prepare for and run an election.
And how many total, if you know, or you can estimate, how many total Michiganians participated in making this last election work, again, in a pandemic under these really difficult conditions?
We had 5.5 million citizens vote in this last election in November 2020. 3.3 million of them voted from home. And coming out of that and making all that happen were 1,600 local election administrators. And then on top of that, there were close to 45,000 election workers all across the state, making sure they were on hand in satellite clerks' offices to count the votes in absentee counting boards after the fact, to ensure on election day all polling places opened on time. It's truly a team effort, but it is fueled by people. It is fueled by people who are willing to serve on the front lines on election day as poll workers, election workers, vote counters, and who are committed to the process and to protecting the integrity of the process above what is in last year and increasingly so, an increased rancor of partisans trying to interfere with their work in a way that would undermine democracy and cause many to lose faith in its security.
Are you worried it's going to be not just harder to vote, but harder to get some of these people to vote? I know in Michigan, there's some question about poll watchers and who gets to choose poll watchers. Other parts of the country, there are legislation bills pending to penalize some of these regular folks if they make a good faith error, both criminally or with civil fines. What are your thoughts on that challenge moving forward?
I mean, we certainly are seeing a dramatic increase in threats to election administrators. That's a result of the unaccountable lies that have been spread by office holders, by leaders, by influencers in a way that has been really detrimental to the livelihoods of people who do serve on the front lines in defending and protecting democracy. That said, at the same time, there's been a parallel growth in people who are determined to step up and defend democracy. I mean, even last year, we recruited 30,000 new election workers because in the midst of a pandemic, a lot of our traditional workers, many of whom are senior citizens, didn't feel comfortable working. And so we put out the call, and I was thinking we'd get a few hundred. We had 2,000 people in the first 10 days sign up. And so, the story of our democracy, and ultimately what will be the story of its success, is when good people step up to fill the void and to serve. And so, yes, we may see less people, we may see more turnover among election administrators because of these threats, but we're also seeing a similar energy and reaction to one that sort of ranges from outrage and disbelief to sheer determination to protect the vote. That's going to fuel, I think, a lot more new election workers to join the team of democracy and work to ensure that our 2022 elections and 2024 elections are similarly smooth and successful.
I get asked a lot. I want to help. I'm worried now. I'm hearing the call to arms that I think you and I both make publicly on a regular basis. But we have the new Delta variant, swarming around COVID. People are a little worried about leaving their homes, or they just don't know how to get involved. What would you recommend to people to how they can help, and particularly for people who feel like they're in a gerrymandered state, such that why should I go out? My vote it's always going to be red, it's always going to be blue. I don't know how I can help save democracy.
Well, a lot of states are changing, and there are a lot of states that would be, let's just say, blue if everyone voted. And that you see, and there are a lot of localities that you could say the same about. I'm sure you could say that about both things. So one, I think we always have more work to do to get more people engaged. And that work ultimately doesn't have to be something big. It could just be hosting a conversation, perhaps even inviting a local election official to talk about democracy, recognizing that every single one of us as citizens have a vote, and we have a vote that and a voice that should be heard. And so making sure if we and we have the power and the responsibility to hold elected officials accountable. And so continuing to find ways to talk to people about our rights and responsibility to do that, whether it's in community gatherings. In fact, this morning participated in a Zoom session of a number of individuals in a neighborhood nearby who simply just wanted an update and learn about what's going on and what they can do about it. There are always ways in which you can participate, but it all starts with education and educating others and speaking the truth on social media. It may feel like you're simply posting something and it's going into the ether, but truly that is how a narrative builds, a narrative of the strength of democracy and the truth. And indeed, the only reason we see misinformation flourish is because others are using their voices to spread it. But if we collectively use our voices to push back and speak the truth in every way we can, to educate ourselves about what's at stake and to talk to everyone we can about how to counter it, we have the best opportunity to withstand these challenges. Whether it's at the local level or the state level or the national level, there are always elections that you can participate in and have an impact in various ways. And holding people accountable who do spread lies, who do continually try to deceive their followers to further their own political agenda. Holding them accountable takes us stepping up and voting and calling them out and telling others to do the same. Those simple acts can change who has power and could hold those who misuse it accountable. And so we all have to, wherever we are, look at ways to do that and find ways to do that in the weeks and months and years ahead. Because the one thing that is certain, it may not be certain. I don't know how we'll emerge out of this moment. That's not written yet. But what I do know, and what history does teaches us, is if we just sit back and do nothing, we lose. So we have one choice: sit back and do nothing, or engage and fight. And the only way we have a chance at succeeding and protecting democracy is if we engage and fight.
I know our time is running short, but I want to ask, you obviously represent every person in the state of Michigan as Secretary of State. So you speak to people across the political spectrum. You mentioned you might expect 300,000 plus people sign petitions to push forward these voter suppression laws in Michigan. How do you change minds on the ground when you talk to voters, those who believe that the 2020 election was stolen, those who believe there's widespread fraud, those that believe that people are voting who shouldn't vote, those who are maybe cynical about American democracy? How do you change minds? Because I agree with this idea, talk about it. That's step one, have these conversations with your friends. But if you have, Aunt Millie or Uncle Joe who, it's just really tough, they're entrenched. What have you found, Secretary Benson, in your experience and expertise, kind of gets people a little more curious and open-minded about this issue?
Well, I think recognizing that, one, we're never going to change all of the minds. Our responsibility and goal is simply to tell the truth and to educate others, knowing that data and facts can be some of the best and really the most effective antidote to the misinformation. But everyone has a choice to believe what they're going to believe, and to then do what they're going to do in furtherance of those beliefs. So that said, I have a background both in journalism as well as in cross-cultural communications, and sharing stories and then listening to each other at the very basic sense in various different settings, safe places where people are gathering, like community centers or places of worship, and actually just talking through the issue without cameras, without politicians, but just having conversations and listening. And then, introducing facts and data into the conversation when it's appropriate to do so can get people at least thinking that there may be an alternate set of facts that perhaps the data supports. But not shying away from those questions from people who are well-intentioned and sincere, but simply engaging, listening to where they're coming from, why they have had bad experiences, why they may not believe in the system. I also think, from my standpoint, it's very powerful to just show people the validity of our machines, for example. It's why we conducted over 250 professional audits in the state of Michigan, because, the truth stands up to scrutiny. And so, we shouldn't shy away from that. It just does cross the line like it is in Arizona, where it's not really scrutiny. It's actually just trying to see, find data points that you can use to further misinformation. But it is an ongoing battle. But it does also require us to see each other's common humanity and talk to each other and listen to each other and share stories and recognize that at the end of the day, we're all in this together, whether it's a public health crisis or the economy or education or just simply the infrastructure of our elections. We all have a stake in having a democracy that works. And we all do have to start operating from the same set of facts and listening to each other if we're going to emerge out of this moment in a more collective, collaborative way, as opposed to the very divisiveness that we're seeing right now.
Where would you send people for those facts, Secretary Benson? Online.
For facts themselves, the local election administrators and the state's chief election officers have been stepping up to just provide those facts. And we've created a fact check website here in Michigan. Several local clerks have done the same. And I think just sitting down and talking to election administrators about that information, and there's a lot of nonpartisan organizations out there as well, but to really question always the agenda of the speaker. And note that oftentimes election administrators, our agenda is simply for just to have people know the truth and believe in democracy because they have every reason to have faith in our processes. But there are others who have more political or partisan agendas, and people need to make their own determinations on how much weight to give to those communications. But I think by talking to local election administrators, talking to the experts, talking to the professionals, the scientists of democracy, you can take out those facts and then find ways to communicate them while also listening to others.
And I love that last point that, listen, this works well. We can exhale. You don't need to worry about this. You have lots with your family. Elections are being run by extraordinary people like you. So Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State of Michigan, thank you so much for being on Civil Politics.
Thank you for having me. And I hope to meet you in person soon.
I would love that.